All right, hello everybody. We're going to do a little bit of throwing practice to just keep it fresh in your minds and build that muscle memory. So I've already slammed my ball of clay nice and hard onto the wheel head, and that creates a nice seal. You then pat it down, get those edges down, and that firms the seal up even more. The reason we need it sealed is because when we start applying pressure to it, if it's not fully on the wheel head, it'll just slip off. And we get our hands nice and wet. We also drag a bit of water onto the piece because wetting your hands is not the same as wetting the actual ball of clay. And then we're going to begin by just mastering the clay for a sec. So I'm just going to tuck my left elbow in, place my weight on that elbow on my leg or on the splash pan, and I'm just going to find my brace point and lean in. Now, for example, that ball of clay was already pretty centered. Let's knock it off. You can see it's got a very big heartbeat. And the key to centering is bracing. So again, left elbow tucked right in, lean forwards. And if your hand doesn't move, the clay will actually form itself to your palm. The reason being, clay is malleable, your hand is not. It sounds simple, but a lot of people forget that clay is actually a lot more malleable than your palm. So the key to being able to master successfully is projecting force through this meaty part of your palm, almost right on the heel. So I want you to imagine a line of force coming off your forearm and straight through the clay. The reason we use this part of the palm is that when our elbow is effectively locked in there and we lean forwards, we engage all our body weight up here, which means that you're not rocking all over the place while you're trying to use your arm strength. It's absolutely unnecessary. This is a really efficient and easy way to throw because you're engaging your body weight instead of your arm muscles. So, by being able to lean forwards and use our body weight, it's going to set us up well for our first cone. So our thumb wraps around the back of the left hand. That's going to act as our leverage point. We're going to be squeezing with these lower three fingers of our right hand. I'm going to lean in, projecting force through that meaty bit of my left palm, and I'm just going to squeeze, and the clay will start to move, and you follow it up. Don't squeeze too hard as it gets to the top, otherwise you might tear it off. And now we've got our vague cone shape. And the reason we have a narrower top on the cone is that it's going to absorb into itself when we cone down a lot quicker and easier. So we've got our vague cone shape. We want the wheel going quite fast for this. And we do the joystick, where we wrap our hand all the way around the clay, fully engaging our palm with the back of the clay. Then the middle bit of our thumb rests right on top of the cone, right in the middle. If we use the pad, it will shred it. If we use this bit of the palm, it's not going to do the job, this middle bit of the thumb, because we're going to make a squashing motion like that while we tip it gently forwards. So I'll do it one-handed, for example. In reality, you'd be using both hands, but we're going to tip it forwards and squash it down with a nice even tempo. And you'll note that clay started to absorb into itself at a really even rate. That's the rate that you want to follow it down with. So once it starts to absorb into itself, you just follow that down. There's a tempo to it. If you follow that tempo, you'll find that your clay is much more evenly distributed and it'll come into center a lot easily. So again, I'm going to tuck my wing in, I'm going to lean forwards, squeezing with my fingers, using my body weight, and I'm just going to cone it up. Something to look for this second time is that when my hand gets a bit lower, I rotate my wrist and I engage this part of the thumb as well. And I end up with my hand kind of looking like this funny little flipper claw. And that's going to give the top of my clay a nice flat surface. And that's going to set us up well for when we open it out. So again, this time I'm going to do it with both hands. Thumb behind the back of the wrist, acting as a leverage point. The right fingers are going to shape the clay as it comes down. And when we get to the bottom, you'll notice that I'm only leaving a kind of third of an opening. And that is the only place that the clay is going to be able to escape out. And that means that we're actually controlling the rate of expansion, and we're actually making it come into center by allowing it to expand into that little opening. So, left elbow, always bracing. Right elbow also resting on something. We're going to gently tip it forwards, squash it down mostly with our thumb. And there we go. It's a pretty well-centered bit of clay. Now, my hands ended up like this. And you'll see, you take it away, you've got a nice gumdrop shape with no flying saucer or mushrooming effect. And that's because I fully engaged my palm all the way down when I was coning, which means if your palm floats off, the clay is going to be able to expand backwards. But if you keep your palm gently pressed against it while you're squashing, having your right fingers shaping the piece and leaving this little opening, you're going to get this nice gumdrop shape. Now remember, the key to all of that, bracing. Brace, brace, brace. It's going to become a shitty mantra. You're probably going to hate it, but if you remember to brace, everything will become easier. So once this is done, we've got our vague gumdrop shape. We're going to open it out. So this is pretty flat. I'm just going to flatten it out by squashing it with my pinky a little bit. You can also do the karate chop, where you use the blade of your palm and you just squash it down. Then we find the pimple by gently resting our index finger near the center of the clay and applying a gentle pressure. Once that pimple forms, we're going to follow it down with a squashing motion. So I place my 2 left fingers over the top of my right, and I'm just going to squash at the back of the pimple. So that is the bit closest to you, and that's really important. If you start squashing from, say, up here, you're going to throw your piece off center. Always keep your finger to the back of the pimple. And it does tend to dry out at this point, so let's just, nice and even rhythm, squash it down. Shred a bit off, not the end of the world. Wet it again, and keep squashing. And you'll notice the top of the clay flares out at this point, which is good, because that's going to make life easier when we actually open it out. Now's the point where you would get your pin tool, and you can check the depth of your floor. So we take the tool, we poke it all the way down to the wheel head, and we run our finger down. Take it out, look at your depth. That's how deep my floor is. It's a bit deep. I mean, it's a bit deep. It's a bit thick, rather. So I'm gonna just press down a little further. And now comes the point where we open it out. We make our finger a rigid hook. Remember, always resting our weight on our elbows or our splash pan, having the wheel going quite fast. And we're just gonna gently draw the wall towards us. So you don't want to go too wide at this point. And now you can run your finger over the bottom. If it's uneven, this is where we're going to compress the base. So we compress the base by just gently compacting from the center and moving outwards. Once we get to the edge, we can go back in. And you can do this as many times as you want. And this should, theoretically, take care of any S-cracking that might occur during the disc firing. S-cracking is a common occurrence when you're first starting out, and it's usually due to your base being too thick or not compacted enough. So we've got our vague shape. Now we're going to do the smush. Hands at 7 and 2 o'clock on a clock face. And we're going to be pushing with these meaty parts of our palms again. Elbows braced. And remember that line of force going all the way through the clay. I want those heels of the hands exactly parallel. And we just smush those walls together. What we're looking for is this vague volcano shape. The reason being, we're going to want to to have a narrower opening rather than if it was, say, out here. Unless you're making a bowl, this is what you're going for. The reason being, that centrifugal force that the wheel is always producing is going to flare your top out when you're pulling. Now, I'm going to ask you to pull to the center, but that's easier said than done when you're starting out. So starting out with a narrower top, and you can always collar it in a little more, you only need to fit a couple of fingers in there, is much easier, because when we do our first pull, it's going to end up out here instead of out here, because we're mitigating that centrifugal force by starting with a narrower opening. Now we're going to back the wheel off to about 50%. We're going to lock our thumbs in the butterfly using these 2 strongest fingers. We're going to place our left fingers on the inside, right fingers on the outside, right down on the wheel head. And I'm going to keep the pads of my fingers, not the tips, not these bits, certainly not these bits, but the actual pads, completely parallel. If you've got to tilt right over at this point, that's absolutely fine, because we're going to be resting all our weight on our right elbow, which is resting on our leg or on our splash pan. Now I'm going to make a little in-out in motion down the bottom here. And it's really subtle, but if you do it right, you'll actually feel the clay start to form a ledge on top of your outer fingers. Once that ledge forms, I want you to gently pinch it and draw up into the center. Again, we're drawing on the angle up into the center of the piece, the center being literally the center that you can see down there. An imaginary line often helps when you're envisioning this. So I'm going to make a little in, out, in, and you'll see that ledge of clay has formed over my right finger. And now I'm just going to pinch it and draw it up. So there's my first pull. And the first pull is crucial because that's what's going to get you a good taper. And your taper is what's going to dictate the strength of your piece. Remember, the taper is the wedge of clay that starts at the base and ends at the top. And we want to be going from thick to thin, always thick to thin. So my second pull, this is where we're going to gain most of the height. Keeping the piece nice and wet. Make your little in, out, in. Dig in with that right finger and just lift up. And we want to be pulling with an even tempo. Always finish the pull, go right to the top. And remember, we are fading the pressure the higher we get. It helps at this point to imagine a pressure gauge with 10 being the strongest and 1 being the least. We want to be using 10 down the bottom and fading it to 1 up the top, coming to 0 as we finish the pull. So our third one, I'm going to have to get my whole hand in there, and that's absolutely fine because we're just going for a straight cylinder now. I'm going to do my little in, out, in, and I'm going to work that clay from the base of the piece up into the body. Now I'm fading the pressure as we get to the top. And you can see that is that vague cylinder shape that we usually make most things out of on the wheel. It's not perfect, and I'd like it to be a little wider, so now I'm just going to push some shape into it. And that's where my left finger becomes dominant. My right finger plays a catching role, and I'm just gently pushing on the inside of the wall with my right finger, catching it to make sure I'm not pushing it too far. We can look at the line of the piece just by bending back. So I've got a little bit that I'd probably want to push a little more shape into just at the top. And this is just where it comes to finesse. And you basically just take your time and make sure the line of your wall is looking good. So there's our vague cylinder. And we want to trim the piece. Get your trimming tool. Yours will often have a triangular head. I'm just using this one because it's what I've got to hand, but the principles are the same. Dig it in, remove some of that clay from the base, because the more surface area you've got with your piece touching the wheel head, the harder it's going to be to get it off. Once you've trimmed it, take your cutting wire, and you can do this with the wheel spinning, or you can do it with it still. As you begin, it's probably better to keep it still, and we just cut the piece. Now comes the hair-raising bit. In fact, for you guys, we're probably going to do this. We're going to do the cut. Usually I would just lift this straight off the wheel head, but for the moment, just keep cutting it with your cutting wire until it grabs, and then you work it to the edge of the wheel head, and then you push it onto your hand and gently place it on whatever. Now clay's got a memory, so if it warps while you're moving it, don't be afraid to just pop it down nice and gently. Because it's got a memory, it will actually come back into shape most of the time. And that is your Wednesday throwing practice video. I hope you enjoyed yourselves.